Hello, fabulous listeners. Thanks for tuning in to All Bodies Outside. This is your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. This episode's guest is Georgia Miller, who is a mental performance coach at Peak Performance Sports, where she teaches athletes and coaches about practical and proven mental performance strategies to improve performance and consistency. She helps improve confidence, emotion management, expectation management, and mental toughness. To learn more about Peak Performance Sports, go to www.peaksports.com. As many of the listeners are aware, I enjoy learning about psychology and social psychology, so I'm looking forward to learning more about mental performance. Georgia, it's a pleasure to have you on Old Bodies Outside.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Dr. Peterson.
You're welcome. And so I have guests that come from all over the United States, all over the world. So where are you connecting in from?
We are located in Orlando, Florida, so the magical land of Disney.
Nice, nice. Well, why don't we kind of get this conversation started and focused on all the great work you do at Peak Performance Sports. And so why don't you tell the listening audience and myself some more about Peak Performance Sports and what you do there?
Yeah, so a majority of our work is working one-on-one with athletes on mental performance enhancement techniques, overcoming any mental blocks, like you said, building confidence, managing emotions. We also run team seminars, helping teams develop a greater team culture, doing larger talks. And then we also work with coaches and helping implement some of these sports psychology techniques into their daily practice planning. And then another cool thing we do, we actually work with sport parents as well, usually of the younger athletes, as sport parents can tend to put a lot of pressure on their kids too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, I love that you also get the coaches involved because I feel like, especially at the youth level, it's probably a lot of volunteer parents and whatnot. And the mental toughness component is so important towards development too. So that's awesome to hear that you get involved with coaches.
Yeah, they seem to enjoy it because they're so focused on form and mechanic and techniques and plays that sometimes they forget to add in the sports psychology themes.
Yeah. I was actually having a conversation. I have an 11-year-old and a 12-year-old. 11-year-old is my son, 12-year-old is my daughter. They both love their sports. And I was talking to my 11-year-old and I kind of just broadly asked him a question, how much of sports is mental? And he's like, breaking it up into different sports. I was like, okay, that's awesome that you see that. And he's in fifth grade going into sixth grade. So this is a pretty big question. But then I was talking to him and I said, okay. And he always said that sports is majority mental, whatever the percentage was for whatever different sport. And so the question then became, if it's so much mental, what kind of training are you doing for that? And he was like, oh, I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what I typically ask a lot of the athletes who come see us who are really skeptical about it. I'll always ask them, what percentage of your sport do you think is mental? I have never gotten a percentage lower than 75 when I ask that question. And they all agree that it's such a huge part of their game, but no one is spending a whole lot of time on it.
Yeah. So that's where Peak Performance Sports comes in. And so when did Peak Performance Sports start in Orlando?
Dr. Patrick Cohn, he's the owner and founder. Pretty sure he started it in 1989. So
wow.
It's been around for a long time, and we've been building and growing. And so there are 3 performance coaches who work. Myself, Jacqueline Ellis, she works out of Chicago. She's great. And then Dr. Cohn works with some of the professionals who come in as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Wow. I did not know that Peak Performance Sports had been around that long. That's great to hear.
Yeah. It's definitely a growing field.
Yeah. I actually came across, I had an ultra runner on here. His name is Don Reichelt. He actually has a few Guinness Book of World Records.
Oh, cool.
And he set the 3 Guinness Book of World Records all occurred on a manual treadmill. And I'm a runner and I actually had not heard of a manual treadmill. And so he had to explain that to me. And that's where it's not like, on an engine going around. You got to push it yourself. And he said that he was going to try and run on this manual treadmill for 24 hours. And he was going to do it in this building in New York City. And he was like, the setting, being on that treadmill for so long, he said that a major part of his training was mental toughness. And he had several mental toughness coaches to prepare. And then I had the epiphany. I was like, oh my gosh, like this is something that's really, really beneficial for athletes.
Yes. Yeah. Well, just think when you get to hour number 12, what is keeping you going? It's just you and your thoughts on that treadmill. That is hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where, some mental toughness coaching would be really helpful.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. We definitely get a lot of runners in. So that'll be good to talk about too.
Yeah, yeah, and that's my background is running, and it's something that I relate really well to because that's what I've done a lot with in sports.
Hmm.
Okay, so let me ask you some questions. And within sports, there's a lot of pressure to perform, even at the youth level and across all levels. How can perfectionism be a good and a bad mindset?
Yeah, so 9 of the 10 of our athletes that come see us are perfectionists. And we always tell them that this is what makes you a great athlete. You are very competitive. And so we usually break down all of the good things about being a perfectionist and then all the bad things about being a perfectionist. So a lot of the good things include you're really competitive, you are very committed, very dedicated, you want to improve, you're always getting the extra reps, coming before practice, staying after. But the downside of that is you usually have these very high expectations. You put a lot of pressure on yourself, harder time letting go of mistakes, and usually very self-critical after performances. So it's just about finding the balance within all that.
Yeah, it sounds like quite a balance.
Yes. Yeah. Typically perfectionists are living in this very black and white world. It's all or nothing. So if their performance is really good, awesome, they're feeling great. If they start off with a couple of mistakes, well, it's harder for them to see the good things that they're doing, and they typically just don't want anything to do with it anymore.
Yeah, yeah. So probably one of the conversations is kind of learning about how to handle those mistakes, the adversity of mistakes, and to see it as like honestly a positive aspect to move forward, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of what we're doing is reframing. We use a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy with our athletes. So that's just a natural type of therapeutic technique that we use in sports psychology. Building awareness as to how your thoughts are directly impacting your actions and decision making and performance in the moment. And so with our perfectionists, we're breaking down a lot of their perfectionist beliefs. Usually I like to ask my athletes, well, what does it mean for you to be perfect? And they'll always tell me, no mistakes, no flaws. And then you ask them, okay, well, is that possible? And they always say, well, no. So it's helping them redefine what perfection means to them.
Yeah, and it's probably fantastic for them to get asked these questions and kind of get outside of their head to help them just identify these thought patterns.
Yes. Yeah. And a lot of what we're doing is building self-awareness. So most of our athletes, they've never been asked these type of questions before. And so once we just start having the conversation around it, they'll be in their daily practices and games on the weekends, and they'll start to recognize, okay, this is what Georgia was talking about. This is how it's impacting me. And so that's the first step in changing everything, is just building awareness as to how your thoughts are impacting your performance and decisions.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. They're out way far away from peak performance sports, way far away from Georgia Miller, and they're doing exactly what you said. I mean, that's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. And it's cool to see that light bulb moment go off for them. Like, oh, and another huge one, usually for perfectionists, is the mind reading. So they want to look really good to other people. So, for instance, if I have a basketball player who makes a mistake on the court and maybe they just airballed, that's usually like so traumatic for basketball players. So they might be wondering what the people in the crowd are thinking or what their teammates are thinking, and now they're playing for other people's opinions. So it's helping them realize, okay, well, what do you think of your teammates when they make mistakes? And they're like, usually nothing. I'm like, yeah, I guarantee your teammates are thinking the same thing about you. Probably nothing.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like when in sports you're really concerned about everyone else, you forget to have kind of some reflection and evaluation on what maybe happened in that moment. You're so worried about the external versus getting some focus on the internal.
Yeah, and that's typically what I see when athletes get really good. They start making these better teams, rise in the ranks, they get older, and they get lost in that. They start playing for all those externals, like you mentioned, and they just lose sight of their process. And so I
Yeah.
always like to ask athletes, well, what got you started playing in the first place? Let's take you back there. And they usually say something like, well, it just looked fun. Or my mom told me to pick a sport and I picked this. And so they aren't focused on the stats and the trophies and the outcomes. They're just focused on having fun. And so sometimes throughout their career, we can easily lose sight of that. So it's helping bring them back down and ground them in their original purpose, why they started playing in the first place.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I liked grounding it in the original purpose because sports, if you look at it, it really is just play, and it's fun to learn a different aspect. It might be in basketball that I'm right-handed. It might be fun that I learn how to dribble very effectively with my left hand, and like I would find that to be fun and be like, wow, that's cool. I learned that, and so that's part of play, I guess you could say.
Yeah, yes, and that's a part of falling in love with the process of working hard, of getting better, and not ever practicing with your left hand because you don't want to fail. And so that's typically where a lot of athletes can go, is not trying new things because they're afraid of that failure.
That's a fantastic point. So it sounds like you all put a big emphasis on the process.
Huge. Yeah, that's usually what we always start off with our athletes. And so redefining what the process means to them. And all athletes are going to have times where they're nervous, times where they're uncomfortable, even the best athletes, even the Olympians. But the great athletes, they always have something to come back to in those moments. What is my process? What can I come back to? I can come back to my self-talk, my routines. They're very well aware of what helps ground them. And so a lot of times athletes, when they're playing really great, they don't really know what they're doing when they're playing really great. So they can't really recreate that when they're playing poorly or they're just off that day.
Oh, nice, nice. So it sounds like you have the athletes define the process for themselves, because it probably can be a little bit different looking for each athlete.
Yes. So I always like to say, I'm sure you've heard of a coach say, focus on the process, trust the process.
Yeah.
And usually get some eye rolls like, yes, oh my gosh, my coach is just shoving that down my throat every practice. But I said, yes, it's cliche, but it's really important to break down what that means for you. And so we break that down, and then we typically like to give them little process goals, help keep them in the moment, and how to refocus back on the process when they get distracted. So we're very realistic in our work. We know you're going to get distracted. We know you're going to make mistakes, but how are you responding to those distractions? How are you refocusing from those? And how are you responding and overcoming those mistakes that you're making?
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And so what would some of these process goals look like?
Yeah, so I just met with a basketball player. So basketball's on my mind right now. So we broke down different areas of his game. He's a shooting guard, so we did shooting, we did offense, we did defense category. And so, for instance, with shooting, we don't necessarily want our athletes to be so mechanic focused. When you're playing your best, you aren't focused on mechanics. You are just allowing your body to do what you've been training it to do. So we want you to trust that muscle memory that you've been building up. So instead of going in thinking, I have to make this shot, I have to score 10 to 15 points every game, okay, let's break that down. Let's simplify it. What are the smaller things that will help you execute that shot, not the outcome of I have to make this? So we said, okay, right, well, focus on the top of the rim. That's in your control. Trust your shot. Commit to your shot. Because a lot of times they might be hesitant, like, oh, I don't know if this is a good shot or not. Maybe I should pass it. And then they're taking like a shot with 70% confidence. Well, that's probably not going in then. Always calling for the ball. That's in your control. The communication is very important. That's a really good process goal for a lot of athletes, because if you're communicating, if you're externalizing everything that you're seeing and doing, there's no time for extra junk to get into your mind.
Nice, nice. I like that a lot. So that's a great little toolbox right there. Mental toolbox, that is.
Yeah. So, and then I like to have them memorize it and play with these at the forefront of their mind. And so obviously when they do start overthinking on the court or field or in the pool, wherever they're at, they have something to come back to.
Yeah. Okay, so gosh, that's a lot of fantastic stuff. And I think that that's a great way to prepare them. What about for just preparing on game day? So say you got a game, and maybe we should stick with basketball. You got a basketball game at 10 a.m. And the athlete, it's going to be a super intense game. It's a championship game. How do you help athletes prepare for the intensity of the competition?
So that comes down to really knowing at what energy level you play best. So some athletes are going to play a lot better when they're more hyped up and energized, and some athletes are going to play a lot better when they're more calm and relaxed. So we always start there. Think about the best games that you've ever had. What are you feeling before the game? Are you energized and hyped up and going, or are you like more typically relaxed and calm? And majority of our athletes, I would say, play better when they're hyped up.
Okay.
So then we come up with strategies. Okay, well, how can we better get you hyped up for the game? And so that might be listening to music. That might be running short sprints, getting your heart rate up, feeding off of the good plays in a warm up. For the athletes who like to be a little bit more relaxed and calm, we might be going through some body scans, some deep breathing. And then whatever it is, it's always important to remind themselves of what's in their control that helps get them mentally prepared. Because especially in big games like a championship game or in a tournament, it's easy to get lost in those expectations of, okay, I have to play really great. So again, it's grounding them back down in the controllables, their process, what they're going to go and focusing on, their plan. For runners, you're a runner, so it's going over your race plan, going over your self-talk, and just hyping yourself up instead of thinking about all of the what ifs and all the negative things that could potentially happen, because that's a big rabbit hole that a lot of athletes tend to go down. They're thinking about the negative outcomes, which just increases their nerves and anxiety for the game.
Yeah, I could see that being detrimental. And I was thinking about myself as you were giving that explanation. And I've been playing sports since I was 4 years old and gone through a lot of different types of, played in a lot of different types of sports, been on a variety of intensity for games. And I've noticed with myself through the years that I'm actually on the side of I need to calm myself before going into, let's just focus on running, before going into a race. I need to calm myself because I think I do get into a lot of heavy what ifs. And instead, I calm myself and I just think about my disciplined game plan. So if I'm running an ultra marathon, there's going to be, it's such a long race, things are going to go bad. But stay disciplined through those tough times. It's okay. Like, I'm going to rebound, get hydrated, get some calories in me, get some salt in me, whatever it takes. But I'm a person that at the start line of an ultra marathon, I try to actually lower my expectations. I feel like when I increase my expectations, like I want to hit this time, I want to be at this pace, the pressure ends up kind of messing me up. And so I lower my expectations as a mental performance strategy.
Yeah, that's a great thing to do. And that's usually what we're always talking to our athletes about. What are your expectations going into this race or this event? And how can we make those a little bit more realistic? And then also with just your comment on the imaginary what if lane, that's what I call it when you get into all the what ifs. Yeah. It's really important to remind yourself of your plan and your process. And for runners, for instance, I like to make it really process focused. So your plan is to just adjust and not judge. You have all the skills you need to adjust to all the adversities that come in a race, because there's usually, when you ask runners, there's never been a perfect race before, ever. We work with a lot of motocross racers and karters here too. There's no such thing as a perfect race. It's all about how you're responding to the challenges in front of you. And so getting them to see that I have all of these previous experiences built up, add into my toolbox that I can whip out in the moment so I can be confident in how to respond if this situation happens, if this situation happens. So a lot of the preparation that goes into helping them prepare for these big races and tournaments and games is breaking down all of the potential challenges that could happen and coming up with responses that they're going to use in that moment so they know exactly what they're going to do. They don't have to think twice about it.
Yeah, gosh, I love that. I think it took me 2 to 3 decades to learn that competing in sports. And I didn't have that type of coaching or mentorship as I was going through sports. And so one of the things that I see a lot with friends that are beginning running in midlife, they often get wrapped up at the start of the race in other people's paces. They get very, this person's passed me, I better stay with them. And I'm always like, you cannot worry about anyone else's pace. Like, do not worry about anyone else's pace. Like, stick to your game plan, stay disciplined. But that took me 2 to 3 decades to really get dialed.
Yeah. I was just working with a track athlete, and he was running the 1 mile. And he had a start, and he told me, he was like, I was so worried at the start because everybody was going so fast and I felt like I was on pace, but I was like, what is everyone around me doing? And then afterward, when his coach was yelling his splits after like the first lap, he was like, oh, I'm fine. Everyone is going to die here pretty soon. And he trusted his plan. And that's exactly what happened. Everybody died and he pulled ahead and he ended up winning.
I have seen that happen so much in running races where people, their adrenaline's going when the race starts and they go out a touch too fast. And if you can stay patient and stick to your game plan, hit that split that your coach wants you to hit, you're going to have a better outcome, in my opinion, for the most part.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important to remind ourselves of what our plan is going in. So we stay patient and we stick with that. We don't get lost in all the random externals that can happen.
Yeah. That plan is really important for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what other types of strategies do you all offer for overcoming, I guess like you talked about teammates, teammates aren't judging you, coaches aren't judging you, crowd, I guess. What about just negative self-talk though, where, some athletes might have a negative critical voice of themselves?
Yes. And that is a life skill that is so underrated. I think everybody in the world should know how to talk to themselves. We're always taught how to talk to other people, but we are never taught how to talk to ourselves, right? If you tell a teammate you sucked today, someone's going to call you out for that. Yeah. If you tell yourself you suck today, no one's going to call you out for it. You're the only one up there holding you accountable. And we would never say things to other people that we say to ourselves. So it's breaking down how your negative thoughts are directly impacting your feelings and your actions. And I always talk about being productive. For athletes who have been forming these negative thought patterns for years, telling them to be positive is like this huge mountain that they're looking at that's impossible to overcome. So I said, you don't have to be positive. Being positive is overrated sometimes. That's not really realistic. But what we do need to focus on is being productive. And the example that I like to use is if you're standing in the middle of a burning building and you're saying, oh, it's okay, we'll be fine. No, that's not okay. You aren't going to be saying that. What's our plan? How are we going to get out of this building? That's productive. That moves you forward. Yeah. The negative self-talk that just holds you back in that past mistake that you just made, that doesn't move you forward. So I think as a society, we just naturally say be positive because that's better than being negative. But for a lot of athletes, that doesn't work. We need to stay neutral. We need to be productive in how you're thinking, not necessarily positive, not necessarily negative, but what's going to move you forward.
Yeah. George, that was a great explanation. I've never heard that before. And you're absolutely right. It's oftentimes like, hey, positive self-talk, and people just say that. But I love staying neutral and making productive decisions. And so how can athletes stay neutral and almost be humble and realistic in this zone?
Mm-hmm. It's a lot of it starts with body language too. So we work with a lot of pitchers here at Peak Performance. And when they're on the mound, and let's say they just walked 2 batters and now their shoulders start slumping, they might show it on their face a little bit. But batters are like sharks. They can sniff out a little bit of lack of confidence in that pitcher, and that's just going to make them feel more confident. Like, oh, okay, I got this. So we really start with your body language. And we talk a lot about having a poker face. So it's not necessarily rolling your eyes, being all negative, but just staying neutral. Nobody should know what you're feeling or what you're feeling or what you're thinking in that moment. Let's keep it very neutral. Let's start with the body language. And then that usually translates into how you're thinking. But what I like to have the athletes do is write out all of these neutral, positive, productive statements and memorize them. That way you already know what to think and do in that moment. You don't have to be searching for something to say to yourself in a very tense situation. Because if you naturally resort to negative thinking, which is what we do as humans, we naturally have a negativity bias, it's going to be really hard in a pressure situation to find that positive thing or a productive thing to say. But if you already have it down, you already have it memorized, it's a lot easier. And so a process that we like to use is recognize, regroup, refocus, or just recognize, replace. There's so many different versions of it. but recognizing when you have a negative thought or a feeling that doesn't help you, and then just replacing it with a better action or better thought that will, again, be productive and moving you forward.
And by having that kind of pre-formulated, pre-practice, it's automated when those situations arise, I feel like, which is very necessary. But I also liked what you said earlier in terms of, being a competitor. When other people see your body language, your shoulders slouching, they can tell that you have a lack of confidence. I think, like, yeah, absolutely, sharks are gonna prey on that, and that's just how it goes. And so, do you, in terms of that, for people to understand their body language, because a lot of times we manifest body language, maybe not even knowing. Do you ever do any like video footage of your athletes to say, hey, this is how your body language looks during competition?
Yeah. I love watching film with my athletes. And it's different than a lot of athletes don't like watching film because usually their coach is just pointing out all the negative things that they're doing. But I like to watch it and point out the positive things that they're doing. Okay, look how you look here versus here, and getting them to come up with some differences, getting them to think independently in that aspect. I also like to have them just bring awareness to it in their everyday lives. So a lot of the athletes we're working with are in college or high school. Our sweet spot, I'd say, is like 12 to 22, the majority of our athletes. So when you're walking around the hallways at school, when you're walking around on campus, start paying attention to what other people are looking like. Like, what can you tell about their body language? And let's start bringing awareness to how you're sitting in your chair. If you're all slouched over and closed off, that's not very confident, versus like owning your space, being tall, broad shoulders, head up. That's just naturally going to help you feel more confident. And so sometimes we just need to lead with those confident actions and let the rest follow.
And I feel like a lot of what you just said too is something that is very transferable to everyday life. So if I'm sitting here slouched like this at work, I may not look very approachable. People look at me like, Brian's having a really bad day. I'm not going to go say hi. But and I like talking to people. So, having that good body language, there's a great transferability to just daily life habits too.
Yes, yeah. And I'm huge on the transferable skills. And so whatever athletes are working on here at Peak Performance Sports, my hope for them is that they're just able to transfer and use it in other areas of their life, because a majority of our athletes, they aren't going pro. So how can you take what you're learning here and apply it to a job someday, or giving a presentation at school?
Well, it's a really great way. I was kind of just imagining like a funnel where you're looking very specifically at a lot of things within their athletic competitions, but you just broaden it out to, most likely they're not going to become a professional athlete, just statistically speaking. And there's going to be things where you can apply these habits to, being a husband, being a dad, being a friend, whatever it is, being a colleague, being a coworker, being a professional. Like, I see all that transferability.
Absolutely. And it's funny, we get a lot of parents calling in, telling us that, my son or my daughter, they're in counseling, but it's just not working out very well. So we thought we might reach out and go the sports psychology route. And what I see a lot of the times is that typically works out better for them, because we understand how much of their identity is wrapped up in athletics. And sometimes they love their sport. It's a lot more appealing to work on things in their sport, like confidence, for instance. That's a huge one that we're always breaking down with athletes. Okay, well, if I'm confident in one area of my life, it's just naturally going to transfer and bleed into other areas of my life. And so the athletes typically like that a lot better than maybe just some general counseling. I'm a huge advocate for any sort of counseling. But for younger athletes, the sports psychology route, they can typically relate to it a lot better for some.
Yeah, I feel like doing it within the scope of something they love, which would be their sport. I feel like, just naturally speaking, like that's going to have a greater impact. They're going to be more intrinsically motivated to want to use those practices and transfer it to other parts of their life, because they learned it in a place that they really love and have fun with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and they want to get better at their sport. Yeah. So naturally, the results are going to follow too, if they're really focused in on the mental strategies that we're working on together.
Yeah. I love that. So we have talked about, being a mental performance coach, and you just brought up sports psychology. And so what is the differences between, because you did mention, you're a mental performance coach. You use some cognitive behavioral therapy, some strategies and tactics from that. There's also sports psychology. What's kind of the difference between the two?
Yeah, so a sports psychologist is clinically licensed. So they're going to have their PhD or their PsyD. I have my master's, so I'm not clinically licensed. So if a athlete comes to me and I think they have an eating disorder, or maybe I'm seeing some depressive symptoms, I'm going to refer them out. I don't have the skill set to help them with those things. A sports psychologist, if an athlete comes to them and they're thinking they're depressed, they can help them. They are trained to do that, but I am not trained to do that. So I would have to have referrals on hand to refer them out to help them get the best help that they need.
Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and that's great that you all also just see, exactly where your expertise fits and where other expertise can help your athletes more than, what your services do. I mean, that's always really wonderful to hear. But
Mm-hmm.
speaking of the services at Peak Performance Sports, what are some other services that Peak Performance Sports? I think I saw something on your website that there's some coaching for doing some stock market trading. Is that true?
Yes, I do not work with the traders. I don't have much knowledge on that. But Dr. Cohn, he works with a lot of traders. And it's interesting, just how, like we were talking about the transferable skills,
Yes.
how
Yes.
the performance in their decisions, and a lot of the traders, they'll psych themselves out if they have a big trade, they'll pull too early and then they regret it. And now it affects their decision making the next day.
Wow. Yeah.
So yeah, that's huge. We work with a lot of actors. I've worked with a couple of musicians before, helping them get ready for competitions. Equestrians, that's a cool sport that we do. But yeah, any sport that you can think of, we've probably worked with them here.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that you've also worked with some musicians and whatnot too. I mean, gosh, like, yeah, that could be really intimidating being on stage, and
Yeah.
especially if it is for a musical competition, that could be really, nerve wracking. So there's a big mental aspect to that.
Yeah, a lot of performance anxiety I'll see with the musicians. And the performance anxiety is just huge with all athletes, but people in general too, like big job presentations or
Yeah.
interviews, job interviews. So, and if you can learn to manage those nerves now, you're just going to be so much better off in the future. But what I typically see too is a lot of athletes, they'll quit their sport because they just can't handle the nerves. They can't handle the pressure that they're putting on themselves, the stress, but it's just going to catch them later down the road in something else. So there's a big difference in quitting because you don't love it anymore and quitting because you just can't handle the pressure or stress of it. And so that's where we like to attack a lot of our work on too, is helping them deal with all those nerves and the stress of it.
Yeah, and I gotta imagine that's where there's a big probably parental aspect to navigating that and making sure that everyone's kind of seeing the decision the same way. Because I think you're absolutely right. Like if these athletes aren't taught about overcoming those nerves and overcoming that kind of mental discomfort, it's only going to rise later in life and maybe in even bigger settings where it could be something that's detrimental towards them getting a promotion or a job.
Yeah, and we'll have parents calling in, my athlete wants to quit, but they're so good. I don't know why. This is all of a sudden. And so we'll do free 15-minute consults here just to see if the athlete is ready for the coaching, if they're a little skeptical about it, so they can meet us, get to see what it's like a little bit. And so with athletes who want to quit, I'll meet with them. We'll talk about, okay, what are the reasons why you want to quit? Is it because you have all this fear of messing up that it's just not enjoyable for you anymore? Let's say if you didn't have that fear, would you be considering quitting? And a lot of times it's, no, I wouldn't. So then it's like, okay, well, let's just do a month of the coaching and see how you feel, see how it helps you. And then other athletes are like, yeah, I know I'm good. It's not enjoyable. I don't look forward to practices. I hate game days. And so then I'll go back to the parent and I say, yeah, they just don't enjoy it anymore. And that's okay. Help them find something else that they could potentially do.
Yeah, yeah, and it seems like with all your interactions with athletes, the way that you've explained a lot of things today is you use a lot of questioning.
Yeah.
And is that true with your? And that's, I think, a great way to work within the uniqueness of each athlete as well.
Yeah, a lot of Socratic questioning, and that helps me not assume. It's
Yeah.
really easy to assume that the athlete has problems with this or this because the athletes that are coming in generally have the same challenges. But I don't want to assume like pinpoints or sources of those challenges for them. And it's always better when you can get them to think about it for themselves when they come to the conclusion for themselves versus you just telling. And a lot of what the coaching is, yes, I will directly tell my athletes, especially if they ask me a direct question, they go, what should I be doing or thinking here? Yes, I'll give you direct advice. But it's always best to weave in those Socratic questioning, the process focused questions in there as well so they can come to the conclusion in that light bulb moment on their own.
Yeah, I feel like that would imprint in their brain a lot stronger, anyways, than you
Yeah.
just saying, "Hey, yeah."
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so you've shared a couple success stories throughout this conversation, and I figured we might as well kind of go towards the conclusion of the conversation with hearing about some success stories at Peak Performance Sports, if you don't mind sharing some of those.
Yeah, yeah. Let me think about some of the recent athletes we've had. One was working with a tennis player. We were working together for probably 7 months. And it really is dependent on some athletes. Some athletes, we just work with them for 4 sessions and they're great, running with their skills, awesome. They just need a little bit of a redirect in their mind. And then other athletes, it's a long, long process. Sometimes we're meeting for a year or two here and there for maintenance. So I was working with this tennis player for about 7 months. Very negative, just naturally always thinking about the negative things, hard time letting go of mistakes. If they lost the first set, they were already losing the second set. And so it was a process, but at the end, we got her thinking a little bit more positive. She was adjusting, not judging the mistakes, found so much more enjoyment in it. She was at the verge of quitting. Her parents were like, if you can't get this together, we're pulling you out because it's not fun. You're just putting so much pressure on yourself. So in that case, I was working with the parents too on how to help her be a little bit more process focused. So by the end, she was doing awesome. She was winning tournaments, and that's really cool to see. I've had some athletes who have a lot of performance anxiety. So we get some pukers where they're puking before every single game. And so that's really cool because you can actually kind of like physically see the progress, right? They'll come in and be like, I didn't puke before my game. And it's like, yes, mini win. So we get them not feeling so nervous before their games. It's a lot more enjoyable for them. They aren't thinking about it 8 hours before. So I've had a few soccer players who were able to get themselves out of that habit of puking, which is awesome. And a tennis player who had a lot of performance anxiety too, like literally a week before would just be all worked up about it, knots in stomach, couldn't eat. And so naturally, when we started managing those nerves, her health started picking up too. So that's kind of cool seeing how it plays out in other areas of their lives. But yeah, just little success stories like that are just awesome to hear.
Yeah, and that was, like, as you said there, you underscored it, the health component for just the broader health component, helping that's fantastic too.
Yeah.
And you mentioned some maintenance sessions as you're highlighting those success stories. Are maintenance sessions, is it just athlete dependent?
Yeah. So sometimes we'll be meeting once a week for 3 months straight. And then sometimes after like 2 months straight of it meeting for once a week, we'll start going, okay, I think you're good. You're in a very good place right now, but let's just continue to meet once a month just to check in, see what new challenges have arisen, if any. And yeah, so that's just really dependent on the athlete.
Yeah. Well, Georgia, this has been a fantastic conversation. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming on to Old Bodies Outside and kind of teaching me and informing the listening audience about mental performance coach and also just the great work y'all are doing at Peak Performance Sports. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, it was a fun conversation.
Yes, it was.
Okay, I'm going to throw on the outro music and we'll call it an episode.
Okay.